right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the March 3rd Thursday Web Forum. I'm Hilary Morris. I work on user support and communications for the South Atlantic and Southeast Conservation Blueprints, and I see a fair number of familiar faces on the line today, so y'all probably know we host this Web Forum on the third Thursday of every month here at 10 a.m., and we hope that it gives you a chance to ask questions and provide input to help guide the future of what we're trying to accomplish for conservation together here in the South Atlantic. So here's our usual agenda. I'm going to skip some of this today because I'm giving our talk, so I've already told you who I am, so we can skip right past the introductions. I'm going to present for about 30 to 40 minutes on our user guides today, and I'll definitely punctuate that with some polls and opportunities for you all to weigh in and let me know what you think. We'll have lots of time for Q&A and discussion at the end. And then I'll wrap up by previewing next month's webinar and sharing some quick updates from your Blueprint staff. I feel like there aren't too many of us on the line today, so I might see if I can keep us out of silent mode just so it's a little easier for us to interact. If everyone can just be real careful to please mute their phone line so we don't get background noise, I'll appreciate it. I'll put us in silent mode if it gets too loud. But before I get rolling, does anyone want to speak up with any questions or comments? Awesome. So I want to start out with a quick poll. The user guides are documents that are intended to help you use the blueprint. What do you want from a document that is intended to help you use the blueprint? I'm kind of curious about your initial reactions and kind of how close we've gotten with this first draft that we've put together. So you should see a poll on the right-hand side of your screen that's now open. It's short answer. If you just jot down what do you want from the user guide real quick and hit submit in the bottom right, I would love to know what you think. All right, thanks guys for giving me your input. What is a user guide? When I look at Wikipedia, it tells me that it's a technical communications document that's intended to give assistance to people using a particular product. And the only tweak that I would make for how we are using it here is that we don't intend it to be technical at all. I really tried to write this as casually as I'm speaking to you all today at a very approachable level. And of course, the particular product that we're trying to help you use today is the blueprint. Just as a quick reminder, what is the blueprint? It's a living spatial plan that prioritizes opportunities for shared conservation action in the face of future change. So it's a map of high priority places where we can all come together in the conservation community and work on some shared goals. The Southeast Blueprint is essentially a bigger blueprint. This is the flagship product of the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. It spans 15 states in the Southeast, as well as Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And it does that by stitching together the South Atlantic Blueprint with lots of other neighboring subregional plans from the Appalachians, from the Northeast, from Florida, from the Gulf, and it's intended to help you with cross-state blueprint uses and uses that would span the boundaries of some of these plans, so it's doing all of that integration for you. We decided to make two separate guides just so that we could keep the focus on each individual blueprint data set. We typically, as staff, use different approaches and data sets depending on where your blueprint use is located. So we thought that this would simplify things to have separate guides for the Southeast and the South Atlantic blueprints. Obviously, we recommend using the South Atlantic Blueprint and the South Atlantic User Guide for any blueprint use that's entirely within the South Atlantic geography, and then we encourage you to use the Southeast Blueprint and the Southeast User Guide for any uses that are outside the South Atlantic or that straddle or span the South Atlantic boundary. So who are these guides intended for? It's really for anyone who wants more detailed instructions on how to use the blueprint on their own. So as always, your user support staff, me and Louise, and the rest of the team here in Raleigh are here to support you if you want help. But we know that some people prefer to work independently, which is fine. That doesn't hurt our feelings. We'll cheer you on from the sidelines. So if that sounds like you, this guide is intended to help you analyze and interpret the blueprint on your own. And particularly, the user guide will help you with that if you're trying to demonstrate the conservation value of a particular parcel when you're writing a grant proposal. That's one of the most common and straightforward blueprint uses that we've seen over the years. And so we've dedicated an entire section to helping you support your grants. And we generally follow a pretty consistent template for parcel analysis, so we were able to write out all the steps for you. We also see the user guide as a great resource for anyone who wants to see some concrete examples of how the blueprint has been used to help them imagine how a plan like the blueprint can apply to them. I know that we do a lot of storytelling about how the blueprint helped identify priorities, how it helped bring in fire funding, but that's pretty general, and we don't often sit down and explain exactly what did we do when we were supporting that grant or when we were helping bring in fire funding. Tell me step by step what you did. So the user guide is getting into those nitty-gritty details, and we hope that it will give you some new ideas about how you might use it in your own work. So basically what we did is we sat down and looked at all the ways people have been using the blueprint so far, and we tried to group those case studies into a few main themes. We felt we had the strongest examples in these 3 categories that you see on this slide, though there's definitely the potential to add some new sections for a couple of other themes as time goes on. Like I said, strengthening funding proposals is probably our most common blueprint use. Essentially what we mean by this is just including the blueprint, referencing it in a grant application to show how your project is going to make a regional impact. You can also report on metrics of conservation impact to strengthen your proposal to help demonstrate kind of the measurable ecosystem health outcomes that would result from taking the particular action that your grant funding would support. Like if you buy this parcel, what would happen? If you did this prescribed burn, what would happen? Depicting organizational priorities, we've worked with various organizations and partnerships to help identify their spatial priority areas based on the blueprint data. And then communicating the importance of your area, that's really about using the blueprint to kind of amplify the importance of the good work that you're already doing, maybe to increase the visibility or help communicate it to new partners or get more support from your leadership. All right, so that's enough background. Let's jump in. We're going to start with the South Atlantic User Guide first. I'm just going to hit some highlights of what's covered in the guide. I thought it would be pretty boring to watch me just scroll through this PDF and drone on over top of it, so I've just tried to cherry pick a few fun things to show you. We start out by explaining the purpose of the guide, which I just covered, and we also provide the contact information for me and Louise, your friendly neighborhood user support staff. It doesn't matter. Pick either of us. Give us a call if you want help using the blueprint. That's why we're here. We also provide a map and an explanation of what area the South Atlantic blueprint covers. We want you to be able to determine right off the bat, does this apply to my area? Is this data set a good fit for me? We show you the various ways to access the data, the simple viewer, the conservation planning atlas, how you can download the data into your desktop GIS program and use it there. And then we provide some introductory text on the blueprint that you can copy and paste. And that's what this looks like. So we figure regardless of how you're planning to use the blueprint, you're probably going to need to explain what the heck it is. So we provide some wording for you to copy and paste, and we try to give you 3 options, depending on what space constraints or word counts you might be working within. So you're going to see this idea of copy-pastable text as a main theme, a main goal of what we were trying to accomplish with this guide. Because I know I have been there where I'm trying to write about an organization or a plan, and I'm on their website, I'm in their reports, I'm trying to splice together all this language from different places, and I'm hoping, gosh, am I talking about this the right way? It's a real big pain, so we wanted to make it easier for you to grab language straight out of this document and feel confident that if it's in the user guide, I can copy-paste this language, adapt it for my purpose, and keep it really simple. And so all of our language is taken from real blueprint uses that we've just updated to kind of reflect the current blueprint and the latest and greatest numbers and all that. So after the blueprint basics stuff, there is a section on each of those 3 main blueprint uses that I just talked about earlier. Let's start with strengthening funding proposals. This is all about showing how your proposal fits into a larger strategy. Right off the bat, we provide some text to use that really plays up the partnership aspect of the blueprint. Sometimes grants ask about how you're connecting with partner efforts or how you're part of a bigger strategy. This text really emphasizes the diverse people and organizations that have been involved in the South Atlantic Blueprint so far. We know that more than 500 people from 150 organizations have been actively involved in developing the blueprint, and that more than 100 people from over 50 organizations have used it or are in the process of using it to inform their decision-making and bring in new resources. So we like to emphasize that in case your grant wants you to talk about it. One of the first things that you're going to want to do is check out how your area scores in the blueprint. That's one of the most common questions we get. How does this look in the blueprint? So whether you're trying to get funding to buy a property or you want to install a living shoreline or whatever, you probably have some spatial depiction of the area where you're working. Usually it's a parcel boundary, but it could be an ecoregion or a county or a state or something else, just depending on the scale of what grant you're applying for. So this map here is just showing the blueprint underneath a parcel boundary, and this comes from a real blueprint use that we worked on. Now you don't need to see the boundaries. If you don't need to see the boundaries of your polygon to know where your area is, You can click around on the simple viewer, and that's probably going to be the easiest way just to get a sense of how the blueprint is scoring roughly in your area. But if you do want to see your boundary overlaid on top, and if you want to do any number crunching for your specific defined area, report on acres, report on percentages, you're going to need to download the blueprint data into your desktop GIS and work within that environment. So this table is just reminding you what is included in each category of the blueprint, how much of the South Atlantic geography is covered by each class. And so now if you're ready to crunch some numbers, you want to report out on how many acres of your parcel are prioritized in the blueprint or what percentage of it is a blueprint priority. The thing you need to know right off the bat is that the blueprint is a raster data set, so it's made up of pixels that are 200 meters by 200 meters. So to do your analysis, what you have to do is analyze only the pixels that fall within your area and exclude everything around it. So in whatever desktop GIS program you're using, there are going to be lots of options for how to do that. But essentially, you just use your parcel boundary as a cookie cutter, you pop your parcel's piece of the blueprint out like you see on this map, and then you can view that resulting information as a map layer or as a table, and we're showing you both here. So to do your calculations, you look at your table, and that'll tell you how many pixels are in each category of the blueprint within your parcel. And then to calculate area, you just multiply the number of pixels by the area of each pixel to get a total area. Remember, they're 200 by 200 meters in the South Atlantic. And then to calculate percent, you can just add up the total count of the pixels, use that as your denominator, divide each category by that total number, and that'll give you the percent in each class. So once you've calculated whatever number you want, area, percent, or whatever, then you report on that in your proposal. And so here are some examples of how we've done that in the past for percent. And then for acres as well. I'll just let y'all know. All right, so that's summarizing the blueprint in a nutshell. We definitely encourage you to copy and paste this text, put in your own percentages, and just go from there. Next, we're going to get into more detail about the connectivity analysis. This is a really powerful way to help tell the story of why your area is important, if it's contributing to hubs or corridors. Now, there is a corridor class in the blueprint. If I back up a couple of slides, you can see, hey, there's corridors class there, but that does not tell the whole story of connectivity, which is why we encourage you to pull up the connectivity analysis itself. So that's made up of hubs and corridors. Hubs are these large patches of highest priority blueprint areas or large patches of permanently protected lands. So the hubs are reflected as dark gray on the terrestrial side and dark blue on the marine side here on the map on the left. Then the corridors are connecting the hubs across the shortest distance possible while also routing through high priority blueprint areas. So that's done through a least cost path analysis that we're essentially optimizing for shortest distance and for high indicator scores. And now the important thing to note here is that because we're encouraging these corridors to route through blueprint priorities, there are many pixels in the blueprint that have a sort of dual identity. They're a blueprint priority because they're important for the indicators, but they're also important as corridors linking hubs. So I point this out because the corridors class in the blueprint only captures pixels that aren't already identified as highest, high, or medium priority. So in other words, the corridors class includes pixels that are only corridors and nothing else. If the pixels are blueprint priorities too, they're going to be put in the appropriate priority class. So you really do have to pull up the connectivity analysis to tease out the full picture of the hubs and the corridors. So to do analysis on the corridors, they're the same pixel size as the blueprint. They're 200 meter by 200 meter. So you'd follow exactly the same steps we talked about for the blueprint. You cookie cutter your area out, you look at your table, you do some math to figure out what percentage of your area is in hubs and corridors. So here's some example language that we've used to talk about connectivity in the past. This is all here in the guide for you to copy and paste. Whether it is a hub or it's adjacent to a hub, either of those things can help make the case for why your area is important. So next, the guide is going to dive into the indicators and how you can use them to tell a more detailed story about why your area is special. The indicators are the data building blocks of the blueprint, so this helps you explain why your area is important in the blueprint. You may also find that sometimes your area isn't prioritized in the blueprint, and there's a couple of reasons why that could be. Maybe it's really, really important for your organization's mission, even if it doesn't rise to the level of a shared priority across the entire South Atlantic, which is okay, but it may still have important indicator values that you can talk about. Or perhaps you chose the site because you want to restore it, so it isn't in great condition, and that would mean the indicators may not be picking it up as a high priority in the blueprint. Or perhaps, your area should be a priority and it's not, but there's some error with the data, some known issue that's causing that not to be reflected. So regardless of the reason, the indicators can help support the conservation value of your area, whether it's in the blueprint or not. So once again, just like the blueprint, there's two ways to look at the indicators. You can use the new pixel mode of the simple viewer to kind of click around and explore. If you don't need to see the outline of your area's boundary to get oriented, and if you're not interested in doing real number crunching, but if you do want to see your boundary on top or you want to do some analysis, you're going to need to download the data into desktop GIS. And so we covered the update of the simple viewer in a previous web forum. Amy Keister, our GIS coordinator, did a great overview of the summary mode, of the pixel mode, some of our new features. So I'm just going to note for y'all here that the guide covers how to do that in the simple viewer if you're interested. I'm going to skip it and go into the GIS side of things here just for time. So to find out what indicators score highly in your area, you're first going to need to determine which ecosystems occur in your area. The ecosystem map shows which ecosystems are present there, and that determines which indicators apply to your area. So the landscapes, the waterscapes, the freshwater aquatic indicators, those are going to apply to the entire South Atlantic region, but there are all of these ecosystem-specific indicators that are, hence the name, specific to one ecosystem. So in this parcel, the darker green on the western side is forested wetland, and then the lighter green in the east is pine and prairie. So when I look at the indicators that apply to my area, I know that that's going to include the landscapes, the waterscapes, the freshwater aquatic, plus all of the pine and prairie and the forested wetland indicators for this parcel. So what we encourage you to do is just toggle on and off all of the indicators that apply to your area. We're just kind of eyeballing roughly which indicators score highly based on the visual pattern of the data. And we're kind of thinking as staff in the back of our minds, how do I translate these scores into a story about why this area is special? What are the things that this grant application cares about? If it's forest legacy, I might be playing up some forest attributes. If it's coastal wetlands grants, we might be talking about, water quality or wetlands. So it really just depends on the unique circumstance. So here we're looking at pine and prairie birds. When we're thinking about what indicators are kind of worthy of mention in a proposal, we consider a high score to be the top 1 or 2 categories. So maybe like 2 and 3 here on this map. But there are also these thresholds of good condition that can help you interpret the indicator values. These are thresholds based on the best available science. They reflect the range of indicator values that occur in healthy functioning ecosystems. We originally came up with those in the state of the South Atlantic because we needed a threshold to help us calculate the grades. So there aren't good condition thresholds for everything, but some of them do have them set. So when you go to the simple viewer and get into pixel mode, any indicator that has good condition threshold set, you're going to be able to tell right off the bat because it's displayed in this red-green color scheme. So forested wetland birds here, you can see it does have a good condition threshold set because it's red and green. And if I click on that indicator, that's going to allow me to learn more. And I can see that for this indicator, the top 3 values are considered good condition. And so that might influence how I decide to report on this indicator or whether I choose to talk about it in my grant. This is also, the simple viewer is a great place to grab language if you need a short description of what each indicator captures. There's always going to be this short text blurb at the top that explains, hey, what is forested wetland birds? What species are included? So next we basically analyze those high scoring indicators to illustrate the conservation value of our area. If I back up, we're going to look back at pine and prairie birds. So like all the other blueprint data sets, the indicators and the ecosystem maps are rasters. They have a 200 meter by 200 meter pixel size. You're probably getting sick of hearing me say that, but I want to emphasize it. You can crunch those numbers the same way we showed you with the blueprint. If you are going to calculate the percent of your area with a particular indicator score, one thing I want to advise you all on is that you need to take careful note of where that indicator applies. So if I were going to report on this indicator that you're looking at in this map, 97% of the pine and prairie ecosystem within the parcel supports at least 2 pine and prairie bird species. So that's 97% of the ecosystem, not 97% of the whole parcel. You can tell by looking at this map that 97% of the parcel isn't blue, right? But when you're not looking at a map, it's a very easy mistake to make. That denominator is key. It's about the ecosystem within the parcel. So basically an indicator outside of its ecosystem has a value of no data, and that's where the sort of blank spaces where you see the base map showing through here. So if you ever feel unsure about where an indicator applies, the summary mode of the simple viewer is a really good resource. The summary mode is the default mode that you start in the simple viewer. It summarizes all the blueprint and indicator information by HUC 12 subwatersheds and by lease blocks on the marine environment. So if you select a unit where that indicator occurs and you click on the indicator, there's going to be this text underneath the score chart, and that's where the red arrow is pointing, and it says indicator values within the active river area in this subwatershed. So if I were going to report on this indicator in this watershed, I would say 99% of the active river area in this subwatershed supports the potential presence of Gulf or Atlantic sturgeon. I would not say 99% of this subwatershed supports sturgeon. It's 99% of the active river area in the subwatershed. So I know I'm kind of beating that to death, but I want you to know that that's really, really important when you're doing reporting on your own. It's easy for us to forget even sometimes as staff. And so this shows you that even though this is a cross-ecosystem indicator, it's in the freshwater, or rather it's in the waterscapes category, you're not off the hook when you're thinking about where the indicator occurs, because lots of our freshwater, aquatic, and waterscapes indicators only apply to the active river area. Okay, so that's enough on that. Once you've done your analysis, here's some example text on how you summarize the indicator scores. So I know this is a lot of text, but this is the type of thing that you can copy and paste right out of the guide and apply to your own use. So this is just talking about an example of forested wetland and pine and prairie, as well as an aquatic example. Now, sometimes we want to dig further into an indicator and pull up the source data. The guide itself shows several examples of data sets where we often do this. I'm just going to show you one here. The guide will show you priority amphibian and reptile conservation areas, or PARCAs. This is data that underlies our forested wetland and pine and prairie amphibians indicators. And it'll also show you how to get in underneath on TNC's resilient land data, which underlies our resilient biodiversity hotspots indicator. So let's look at the PARCAs. Pine and prairie amphibians and forested wetland amphibians pull out the portions of these contiguous priority amphibian and reptile conservation areas, or PARCAs, that occur in each of those ecosystems respectively. So if you notice that you have high scores on your amphibians indicators, it actually makes more sense to summarize how much of your area falls within the PARCA as a whole, rather than reporting separate calculations for each ecosystem, because they're really drawing on the same data set. So you can get to the PARCA data on the CPA. It includes both the spatial boundaries of each PARCA and a great description of why each PARCA was selected by all these amphibians experts. What is it important for? So you can make your maps and do analysis on how much of your parcel is in the PARCA, but you can also do a nice explanation of what the PARCA is capturing. So here's an example write-up on PARCAs. The italicized text is actually straight out of the description for each PARCA in the data set. So if you do this, you're obviously going to need to tailor this description to whatever PARCA you are looking at, but this can be a really nice way to speak to the amphibian and reptile value of a parcel that you're analyzing. So I'm going to move on to threats. Grant proposals often ask how threats like urban growth and sea level rise are predicted to affect your area, and determining the risk that that area faces from these sorts of threats can help emphasize why we need to take conservation action there. So there are a lot of different threat layers that are available for the South Atlantic, and they're easy to use in conjunction with the blueprint. I'm just going to show you sea level rise here today as an example, but the guide covers sea level rise, urban growth, and solar energy development. So for sea level rise, we like to use NOAA's inundation data. These are models that illustrate the potential flooding posed by future sea level rise over a range of scenarios from a current level. They call it mean higher high water, which is basically the average of two highest daily tides in areas that have two high tides. So a couple of things to note: all of the projections for this data set are based on the best available elevation data. There is some uncertainty that comes along with that, and these scenarios are not linked to time. So the guide is going to link you to several ways where you can access and use this data, including NOAA's Sea Level Rise Viewer and the CPA, and downloading it into your desktop GIS. But if we assume for the moment that you brought it into your GIS, what we typically do is we add up all the scenarios cumulatively to compute the percentage of the area that's likely to be impacted by inundation with up to 6 feet of sea level rise. And you have to keep in mind that the area impacted by inundation at the 6-foot scenario also includes the areas that are projected to be inundated at the 1 foot and the 2 foot and the 3 foot and the 4 foot and the 5 foot and the current as well. So you have to consider all of the other scenarios that come in the range below it. So if your area is projected to be impacted by inundation, we really encourage you to highlight how it will assist with wetland migration. You can make a case for how protecting that parcel or managing that parcel will buy time and space for coastal ecosystems to move inland. If it's not projected to be inundated, you can make a case for more of a climate resilience perspective, emphasizing how this parcel is going to be an enduring investment, it's resilient to climate change, it may offset the losses of other conserved lands that are being impacted by sea level rise further toward the coast or at lower elevations. So you can really make a case either way. Here are a couple of examples of how we often talk about sea level rise, using an example where a parcel was affected and one where it was not affected. Okay, so depending on the user request and the specific requirements of a proposal, sometimes as staff we will do extra analysis, kind of above and beyond what we just talked about. I'm calling this advanced applications in the guide, just to let you know that it is a little bit too complicated for us to lay out step by step how to do it in the same level of detail that we're able to do with the blueprint and the indicators and the threats. So if you are interested in this type of thing, you will need to contact user support, but we would be happy to help you with it. This is really all about predicting the on-the-ground impacts of conservation action, and that can be super, super compelling when you are submitting a proposal. It shows that, hey, my project is going to make a tangible difference, and it shows that you're committed to accountability and really measuring that return on investment. Some proposals even require you to show how you're going to use metrics to compute that ROI. So staff have used this approach successfully for a few different proposals in the South Atlantic. This guide is going to get into how you can use the South Atlantic indicators, how you can do measures of water quantity and water quality that will result from the action that you're proposing. I'm just going to talk about water quantity here to give you a taste. So you've probably heard us talk before about how the blueprint through the Department of Interior's Wildland Fire Resilient Landscapes program helped bring in $3 million over 3 years to support prescribed burning in priority longleaf pine focus areas across the geography. And in that grant, actually reporting on the impacts of the prescribed burns using ecosystem metrics more than just a total acres burned. But that was a key requirement of the grant. We had to show how we were going to do that when we applied. So to help with this, we started investigating how prescribed fire in longleaf can help increase water availability. And that's because regular fire is reducing the leaf area of understory plants, and that in turn is reducing water loss to evapotranspiration. And we may not know yet exactly where that extra water is going in the ecosystem, like into the soil, or is it recharging an aquifer, or is it showing up in surface water? But we can estimate the quantity of water saved. And so we did this by using the Forest Service's WASI model, the Water Supply Stress Index model. And we had some estimates of paired leaf area in burned and unburned sites, and we were able to use that to predict increases in water yield. And so we have a GIS layer for this. We don't have it up on the CPA yet, but it'll be up soon. In the meantime, like I said, reach out to user support for help if you're interested in this. But here's an example of how we summarized this information in the grant. So we were measuring it in millions of gallons per day, trying to use a unit that most people could wrap their heads around in gallons. Okay, so here in the guide at this point, there's a case study that gets into how the Georgia DNR used the blueprint to strengthen a coastal wetlands grant. Each of the sections in the guide have case studies at the end that really show exactly what we did for a particular example. I already got into this case study in a fair bit of detail in a previous web forum, so I'm going to skip it. It's there in the guide if you want to read it. The next section of the guide in the South Atlantic focuses on depicting organizational priorities. This section is pretty much entirely comprised of case studies. We have one on the South Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy and how they use the blueprint to identify their statewide priority areas in their South Carolina conservation vision. There's another example of how the Fish and Wildlife Service used the blueprint in a landscape conservation design for the Big Bend of Florida. Again, we've talked about those in depth on previous web forums, so I'm going to talk about a different one, the one in the middle here. So the Longleaf Alliance has been working closely with local implementation teams to help those partnerships map their restoration priorities. And they started by looking for some regional resources that were going to help them come up with an initial set of priorities that they could build on. They wanted something that was based on solid data, something that was already reviewed by a lot of people and organizations, and they needed something that covered the whole longleaf range. And if that sounds like the blueprint to you, that is exactly what they thought. So they ended up using the South Atlantic and the Southeast conservation blueprints to identify potential high-quality open pine habitat that was located off of partner lands. and to support kind of data compatibility across the Longleaf range. So far, the Longleaf Alliance has worked with the 3 LITs that you see starred on this map, Chattahoochee Fall Lines, Solo Ace, and DeSoto Camp Shelby. There's a much more in-depth overview of this case study in the guide, and most of the write-up actually comes from an article that was published in the fall 2018 issue of Longleaf Leader magazine, which is a quarterly publication of the Longleaf Alliance. So if you're really curious to read more about this, there's a lot of places you can go for that info. Now, the last section is on communicating the importance of your area. And so far, we have really one good, strong case study about this, where we worked with Sumter National Forest to talk about the promise of the Piedmont and the importance of all the conservation efforts that they're doing in the Piedmont of South Carolina. This is another one that we've already covered on a previous web forum. So I'm going to move on to the Southeast guide now and just kind of highlight what is different about the Southeast and the South Atlantic guides, because a lot of this covers the same sort of ground, and I don't want to repeat myself and bore you all to death. So the user support contacts are immediately going to be different for the Southeast Blueprint. We have state leads for the Southeast Blueprint because it's covering way more ground, and that's just more than Louise and I can handle, and we want to make sure that we're matching you with the person who has the best expertise in your area. I just don't know all that much about some of the data that was used in the Gulf or in Texas through their crucial habitat assessment tool. There's a lot of differences in the technical information, so we want to get you with the person who knows your area the best. Some of the basic elements are also going to be different. Obviously, the Southeast Blueprint's covering a different area. You're going to go get the data in a slightly different way, although it is also available on the Southeast Conservation Planning Atlas. You can download it into GIS, and we're giving you different introductory text that you could copy and paste into whatever blueprint use you're working on. Again, we give you 3 links, hoping to accommodate whatever word count constraints you're working with. The Southeast Blueprint has, the guide has the same major themes and sections. Let's start again with strengthening proposals for funding. We have a section on telling the partnership story here as well. The involvement numbers are different. They're a lot bigger for the Southeast Blueprint because they reflect all of the various sub-regional plans that are feeding into the Southeast Blueprint. So you can see more than 1,700 people from 500 different organizations have been actively involved in the Southeast Blueprint. And similarly, the numbers on Blueprint users are a little bigger too. There are more than 130 people from over 50 organizations who have used or are in the process of using the Southeast Blueprint. So we also have a new section on connecting to the CCAS overarching goal, which you can see here. The goal is a 10% or greater improvement in the health, function, and connectivity of southeastern ecosystems by 2060. This is a long-term goal. Obviously, with the 2060 date, it's intended to be both ambitious and achievable. There are also these short-term goals that nest underneath it that help demonstrate that we're on track and meeting interim milestones to ultimately make that 2060 goal. So you can see that one of those short-term goals is all about increasing actions within the Southeast Blueprint. So when you are working within an area that is prioritized in the Southeast Blueprint, you can connect back to the goal and say, hey, this action that I'm proposing, it helps contribute to this goal of a 10% or greater improvement in health, function, connectivity of southeastern ecosystems by 2060. And I think that can be a pretty powerful thing to say. So here's some text on connecting to the overarching goal that you could borrow to strengthen your proposal. Okay, now onto the blueprint itself. Obviously, this is a slightly different data set. It has 2 different categories, high conservation value and medium conservation value. The table will show you kind of what each category is capturing. Once again, to analyze the Southeast Blueprint, you're going to download the data into GIS and overlay your area spatial boundary. There's no simple viewer for the Southeast Blueprint, so this is really the best option for the data set. You can either work with it on the CPA or you can download it into GIS. And to crunch numbers on this data set, the Southeast Blueprint is also a raster, so you're going to use the same overall approach of cookie cuttering out the blueprint and checking out your table. The difference here that I want to emphasize is that the pixel size is different for the Southeast Blueprint. It's 30 meter by 30 meter pixels. So the area calculations are going to be slightly different when you're multiplying by the size of the pixel, but the percentage calculations will be the same because you're just dealing with the counts here in this table. So the guide gets into all of this in detail. Just hitting the highlights here. Once you've done your analysis, here's some text you can copy and paste for percent of the area and for acres of the area, whatever makes the most sense to you. Now, the Southeast Blueprint also has a connectivity layer, and that layer combines the hubs and corridors from the South Atlantic, which we talked about earlier, with the naturescape design input from the Appalachians. So generally, this is analyzing the connectivity is going to be a pretty similar approach to the South Atlantic. It has two classes, hubs and corridors. One difference, a key difference, is that the Southeast hubs and corridors are served up as vectors, and so that might be a little bit more familiar to many of you if you're more accustomed to working with vector data. So you won't be looking at tables of pixel counts here, but the overall gist is the same. This is a linkage mapper analysis, a least cost path based on integrated prioritization of lands and waters. So the Appalachian and the South Atlantic approaches are fairly similar, and so we feel pretty comfortable stitching those together and serving them up for you to use as an integrated data set. So again, the hubs and corridors only cover the Appalachian and the South Atlantic right now, but we are looking to add connectivity from other regions of the Southeast in the future, and Rua will probably be talking about that in his web forum next month when he talks about what's next for CCAS. So that's a priority improvement for the Southeast Blueprint, is expanding the connectivity. So here's some example language on connectivity for the Southeast Blueprint that you can borrow. Let you look at that for a sec. Now for the Southeast Blueprint, there's no section on diving into the indicator data because all of the various sub-regional inputs to the Southeast Blueprint, they use different methods. Not all of them have indicators. And similarly, there's no section on using the data that underlies the indicators for the exact same reason. What we have instead is a section on using complementary data, data that we often combine with the Southeast Blueprint to help strengthen proposals. And in the Southeast Guide, this is really focusing on the Nature Conservancy's resilient lands analysis. This information is also contained in the South Atlantic Guide. It's just not getting into the parkas, basically, is the only difference here. So from here, we move on to threats. The Southeast Blueprint Guide has the same 3 threats: urban growth, sea level rise, solar energy development. So I'm going to gloss over this as well. And same with advanced applications for reporting on metrics of conservation action. The only thing that's different is the Southeast Blueprint is leaving out the section on how to use the South Atlantic indicators in reporting, but it's also going to talk about water quantity and water quality impacts. So that brings us to the case study on strengthening proposals, and I decided to get into an example from the Southeast Blueprint that I haven't talked about on a web forum before. So essentially here, the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources requested support for a forest legacy grant proposal. They were applying for funding to protect a parcel in Greenville County. They wanted to show how that parcel fit into the blueprint. And we've worked with this person a lot with South Atlantic Blueprint uses, but this particular parcel was located in upstate South Carolina outside the South Atlantic Blueprint. And so we analyzed it using the Southeast Blueprint because the Southeast Blueprint provides full statewide coverage of South Carolina. So we started by introducing what the blueprint is. And then we overlaid Southeast Blueprint 3.0 with the parcel to see how it scored. And we found that it scores really highly, that 90% of the parcel is prioritized in the blueprint. And so we included some text about the blueprint score, about how those categories shake out. And since this parcel is entirely within the Appalachian subregion of CCAS, we looked at the underlying data from Naturescape that's driving those priorities. Just like in the South Atlantic, we look to the indicator data that's driving the South Atlantic Blueprint priorities. We wanted to get under the hood here as well. And we found that its value in the Southeast Blueprint was really all about its importance for biodiversity and the Appalachian target species that were predicted to be supported by this parcel. So we did this write-up on the Appalachian Naturescape data and the species richness information. And then next we started looking at biodiversity resilience in the face of climate change using the Nature Conservancy's resilient land data. So this is all about this idea of conserving the stage, this data that the exact species that a particular area supports may change as the climate changes, but that places that have a high level of diversity are likely to maintain their high level of biodiversity in the future, even if those individual species might be turning over. So we started with the final resilience score. This is a product of two factors. One factor is landscape diversity, the other is local connectedness. So landscape diversity, that's capturing kind of intrinsic properties of the site about the microhabitats that are available. It's looking at things like landforms and elevation and wetlands. Local connectedness is all about connectivity and fragmentation and barriers to dispersal. So in a nutshell, the point I'm trying to make is that landscape diversity is fixed. Those are the intrinsic aspects of the site and the biodiversity it can support. Local connectedness can be influenced by management. So overall, when we ran the final resilience numbers, we found the resilience of the site is really high. There's a lot of it that's above average in its resilience. That's great. We also checked out landscape diversity too, and we found that landscape diversity was even higher, which you can tell as you look at these side by side. The one on the right is a lot darker green. So what that tells us is that fragmentation is a little bit of an issue for this site, and you can kind of see the roads and the developed areas going through it. And so there's room for local connectedness to be improved here. And if this site gets acquired and managed appropriately as a result of getting this grant funding, connectedness probably will go up, which will further increase its climate resilience. So we did a write-up on both of these components of resilient lands. It's really super resilient. That's awesome. It's a sound investment. It's going to continue to be valuable even in the face of climate change. And if it's protected, restoration and management efforts are going to make it even more important for climate resilience by improving local connectivity. Then the last component that we looked at for resilient lands was underrepresented settings. So another key piece of the resilient land analysis is this idea of geophysical settings. These are distinct combinations of soil type and elevation and landforms that support different ecological communities and species. They are really the data foundation of resilient land because all of the scores are stratified by geophysical setting. So in other words, an area's resilience and its diversity and its connectedness scores are all calculated relative to other examples of the same setting. That ensures we're comparing apples to apples. Otherwise, we would be grading flat coastal areas against steep mountain slopes. And we know those steep mountain slopes are always going to support more biodiversity. We don't want to prioritize one at the expense of another. We want examples of all of those different types of ecosystems to maximize climate resilience overall. So what the Open Space Institute did is they analyzed how these settings were represented within our current portfolio of protected lands. And it identified which ones are missing, which ones do not have their fair share of conservation. So this proposal is entirely comprised of one of these underrepresented settings, so protecting it would help fill an important gap by ensuring that there's an example of this setting that's permanently protected so it can continue to support biodiversity in the future. Next, we looked at Sleuth. Sleuth is developed by the Southeast Climate Science Center. It's an urban growth model. We typically report on urban growth projections by looking at either the percent of the urban footprint that is predicted to be urban by 2060, or we look at the percent change in the urban footprint from the present day to 2060, and we kind of typically choose whichever one looks more dramatic or better supports the case that we're trying to make for the grant. You can use really any decade that you want. Sleuth has every decade from, I believe, 2020 to 2100, but we typically use 2060 because it matches the overarching CCAS goal, and because it's just kind of a nice balance of being long-term. So you are going to see change over time, but it's not so long-term that human beings can't wrap their head around it. So it's kind of in that sweet spot, but you can use whatever you want. If your area is predicted to experience a lot of urbanization, you can really make a case for the urgency of conservation action. Like if we don't act now, this opportunity could be gone. It could also indicate that the conservation that you're doing may really benefit recreational opportunities for growing urban areas because that parcel might be serving a greater population. But on the other hand, if your area is not predicted to urbanize, it's kind of one less thing to worry about. And there are benefits to working outside urban areas. It's easier to burn, etc. So you can really make a case, kind of like sea level rise. You can make a case either way. It's just helpful to understand what urban growth is predicted to mean for your area, so you can kind of weave that into your narrative. And so this is the text that we wrote up for the Forest Legacy Grant. And I'm going to skip a little bit over these last slides for time. Because we were in the Appalachian geography, there is an Appalachian LCC energy forecast model that we brought in to analyze this parcel that looks at the probability of wind and gas energy development. But essentially, the moral of the story is it wasn't predicted to have a big impact, so we included it in the interest of thoroughness, but it wasn't predicted to be a huge deal. So I'm just going to gloss over that. The last two sections depicting organizational priorities, communicating the importance of your area. In the Southeast Guide, these are really covering the same ground as the South Atlantic they include all the same case studies. So I am going to wrap things up here. So in a couple minutes, I am going to open it up for questions and discussion, but I am hoping to end with some polls, just like we started some polls. So I'm curious to know, now that you've kind of seen this whirlwind crash course on the user guide, do you have any immediate ideas on what improvements you would like to see in the future? So if you could type those in to the poll on the right, I would really love your input. Thank you for filling that out, folks. I'm really interested to go back and read these. And the last poll, I promise, but I am super, super interested in your opinion on this. One thing that we have been batting around as a South Atlantic staff is the idea of adding a GIS appendix to this report. So there's a lot more room for us to get into the specifics of the analysis side of things in terms of, like, say you're using ArcGIS Desktop 10.4 and you have the Spatial Analyst Toolbox. You can use Extract by Mask to clip the blueprint out to your parcel, and you would need to check these boxes on your geoprocessing parameters. So we're talking something like excruciatingly specific with screenshots of the tools and a lot more detail. And I'm really curious whether that would be useful to you all or not. So I'm going to do another WebEx poll here just to learn a little bit more about how you use GIS in your office, how comfortable you are using GIS. So I left 5 minutes for this poll. There's just 5 questions. So if you wouldn't mind scrolling through and giving me a sense of where you fall on these, it would really help us figure out what direction to take this report in the future and whether it's worth pursuing something like that. Okay, thanks again to everyone who filled that out. So one thing I didn't say is where to get these guides. So basically they're going to be automatically downloaded when you download the blueprint data, either for the Southeast or the South Atlantic. They're going to come along with that data download package. They're also available in the data galleries for each of the blueprints on the CPAs, and they're also linked from the blueprint pages on each of the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy and the South Atlantic website. So if you have any trouble finding any of them, certainly let me know. There's also blogs on both of those websites that link you to all of this as well, since this is kind of a hot off the press document. So hopefully you won't have any trouble finding it, but I'm happy to help. Everyone can manage their own mute because we haven't been in silent mode today. Does anyone have questions or comments that they want to speak up and tell me? All right, well, hearing none, I will move on to a quick update on what to expect for next month's web forum. You might have seen in the February newsletter, or in the March newsletter, that we put out a flyer for the next 3 months of web forums. We did have an unexpected cancellation, so we've had to shuffle things a little bit around since then. So next month, Rua is going to be giving us a presentation on April 18th, same time, same place, on what to expect from CCAS. So he's going to go over some of the main blueprint uses that the Southeast Blueprint staff have been focusing on supporting. There'll be some examples at a county level, a state level, and across multiple states. He's also going to talk about the Southeast Blueprint improvements that are coming soon. That's including improved integration of all these sub-regional plans, improved coverage of various resources that are captured in the blueprint, improved connectivity. So we hope that you will tune in next month for the latest on that. One quick staff update. I'd ideally like to ask Mallory to give this, but he's traveling this week, so he's not able to be on, but he did write a great blog about it that went out in the South Atlantic newsletter last week. The Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies had the Landscape Conservation Working Group that had a meeting where they were focusing on learning about past and current landscape conservation initiatives. They were giving a space for lots of different partners to share their expertise and insights. And the most exciting thing is they are identifying elements of a work plan for their working group. And so I think there's going to be some interesting things coming out of this work group that might bear on CCAS governance and some other things that will be of interest to this community. So I encourage you to check out Mallory's blog if you're interested in learning more about that. As always, I'll end on this slide. How do you get involved in the blueprint? We encourage you to join the South Atlantic LCC web community to get our newsletter and a reminder about this monthly web forum. You're always welcome to connect with your blueprint staff here in Raleigh. That's me and Louise and Amy and Rua and Mallory and the rest of the team. And we'd love for you to explore the blueprint online. Tell us how it's working for you. Hopefully the user guides may help you with that. With that, we do have 3 more minutes. It's been a real quiet day. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear what you think. Okay, not hearing any. We'll just let everybody go. It's 10:57, so we ended on time. Hope you'll tune in next week. Thanks again for joining us, or next month, sorry. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.